On November 7th, 2024, as Amsterdam's Jewish community joined with local officials to commemorate Kristallnacht at the city's Portuguese synagogue, a new Jew hunt took place on the streets of Amsterdam. This outbreak of anti-Semitism, and its pretext as something to be blamed on his Jewish victims, evoked not only the Nazi-organized violence of November 1938, but its justification. According to the Nazis, the targeting of Jews on Kristallnacht was the public's understandable reaction to the killing of a German embassy official in Paris by a Jewish teenager. Was this an example of history repeating itself? Camera researchers went behind the headlines to dissect the story of the anti-Jewish violence, the pogrom, that occurred in Amsterdam, and the counter-narrative that justified it. It's an exemplar of the new anti-Semitism, and how it is justified and normalized around the world. While some elements are unique to the Netherlands and contemporary Europe, the new anti-Semitism reflects the historical pattern of classic anti-Semitism everywhere. It is both a cautionary tale about how the new anti-Semitism has gained ground and a prescriptive one about what can be done to combat it. In March 2025, the following conversation was recorded between camera research analysts Ricki Hollander, who investigated the combination of forces that propelled the events, and Gilead, who exposed some of the lies on which the counter-narrative was built. They discussed the Amsterdam Jew hunt and how it reflects the global anti-Semitism that has only intensified since the October 7th massacre.
It may at first seem ironic that a Jew hunt or pogrom took place recently in Amsterdam. It was once known as Jerusalem of the West for Jews in the diaspora. In the 16th and 17th century, it had served as a safe haven for both Sephardic Jews fleeing the Spanish Inquisition and Ashkenazi Jews fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe. But that's the story of anti-Semitism. Tolerance can give way to intolerance, and a haven can become a place of danger. And so it was in the Netherlands, where Jewish communities had flourished for centuries, that the Nazis succeeded in eliminating 75% of Dutch Jewry. That's the highest percentage of Jews annihilated in any Western European country during the Holocaust. It was the result of a complicit Dutch civil administration, a large number of Dutch collaborators, and a non-Jewish population that was largely passive about what was happening to the Dutch Jews. Now, after the war, the Dutch revised this history by focusing on the cases of Dutch resistance and heroism and hiding Jews, as if this represented Dutch society as a whole standing united to repulse Nazi evil. They de-emphasized Dutch complicity with the Nazis, and they downplayed the specific targeting of Jews. So instead, the victims of the Nazis were cast as the Dutch population as a whole. And this mythology persisted until the early 1960s, when Adolf Eichmann's trial in Israel sparked a new interest in the Nazis' war against the Jews, and this became a topic of scholarly research. The Dutch people began to face the truth about the Holocaust Jewish victims and about their own role, and they eventually made reparations to the Jewish community. Scholars and journalists and Dutch society across the political spectrum stood firmly against all manifestations of anti-Semitism, which they recognized and they condemned as an evil to shun. But this united front began to crumble at the beginning of the 2000s with the arrival of the new anti-Semitism, that form of anti-Semitism that masquerades as pro-Palestinian advocacy. Now, the new anti-Semitism in the Netherlands came primarily from extremists within the large Arab and Muslim immigrant communities, those who had arrived from the Middle East and North Africa, and whose affiliations lay with the Palestinians in the Arab-Israeli conflict. Anti-Semitic incidents increased, including attacks on Dutch Jews, sympathy expressed for Hitler, calls for death to the Jews, and the use of Nazi imagery during pro-Palestinian demonstrations. Protesters, for example, desecrated the statue of Anne Frank in Amsterdam. At the same time, Dutch society and politics became increasingly split about what constitutes anti-Semitism.
And it's a split that reflects broader polarization in the Netherlands as a whole, right?
That's right. The Netherlands has a multi-party system with members of the House of Representatives elected through proportional representation. And this has resulted in coalition governments where different parties that are focused on their own specific issues depend on each other to keep power. The current coalition government's largest party is the Party for Freedom, known as the PVV, founded and led by Geert Wilders. Wilders is a staunch supporter of Israel and a longtime defender of the Jews. He's also known for his opposition to immigration and to Islamic extremism, and he's condemned by his critics as a far-right populist and racist. Among his fiercest opponents are those who sympathize with Arab and Muslim anti-Israel activists, whom they see as victims of Islamophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment. Refusing to recognize the new anti-Semitism for the anti-Jewish bigotry it is, they view anti-Jewish hate speech and violent attacks coming from Muslim extremists as legitimate protest against Israel or against Jewish tribal support for Israel, which they consider a rogue state.
We don't want the Zionists here! We don't want the Zionists here!
They objected to the Dutch Parliament's adoption of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, and that's the definition of the
International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance.
Yes, which is widely accepted across the world. They claim, falsely, that it conflates anti-Semitism with criticism of Israel, which it certainly does not. Now, this political and societal divide in the Netherlands has resulted in the weakening of the widespread stigma that previously existed against all manifestations of anti-Semitism. And we saw this particularly after the Hamas massacre of October 7th, 2023, when anti-Semitism surged in the Netherlands, as it did everywhere else in the world. Dutch Jews were accused of complicity in genocide. Mezuzahs were torn from doors and Jewish sites were vandalized with swastikas. Jews were verbally abused. They were threatened, physically attacked. And Jewish schools were forced to close due to security threats. When Holland's first Holocaust museum opened last March 2024, a consortium of some 200 pro-Palestinian Dutch Muslim clerics urged the Dutch king, Willem-Alexander, to boycott the opening ceremony. They didn't succeed. He attended the ceremony along with Isaac Herzog, the Israeli president, who pro-Palestinian groups tried to bar from the Netherlands. And they protested against his inclusion in the opening ceremonies, accusing him of genocidal sedition. Some of these protesters became violent, throwing fireworks and eggs and clashing with the police. And since the Hamas massacre, Dutch pro-Palestinian groups have been holding regular protests and marches almost daily, with chants of "From the River to the Sea," which is a call for the destruction of the Jewish state and which has become the slogan to describe Hamas's goals.
From the river to the sea!
On October 7th of 2024, the first anniversary of the Hamas massacre, while Jews and their supporters around Europe were holding commemorative events for the victims and calling for the release of the hostages, there was another protest. A large group of masked pro-Palestinian demonstrators marched towards a group of Jews who were mourning in Amsterdam, who were holding a commemoration of the massacre. And they marched towards them shouting the Hamas slogan, "From the river to the sea," while they waved Palestinian flags and held placards, and refused to move to a designated protest space. They clashed with police. And this occurred just 4 weeks before the Amsterdam pogrom. Nowhere was the anti-Semitism in the Netherlands as rampant as it was at soccer venues. Even before the massacre, anti-Semitic curses in Dutch soccer were commonplace. Popular slurs include Jew or nose, which is a reference to the stereotype of Jews having large noses, and cancer Jews. Cancer Jews is one of the more popular anti-Semitic epithets used in the Netherlands. Fans make whooshing sounds to imitate the noise of escaping gas in order to evoke Nazi gas chambers. And they routinely jeer, particularly Amsterdam's Ajax team, which isn't even a Jewish soccer club, but it's viewed as having Jewish affiliations. Some of its hardcore fans even call themselves super Jews, even though most aren't Jewish. So chants that are aimed at this club and at Jews in general include Hamas, Hamas, all Jews to the gas. And my dad was in the commandos, my mom was in the SS. We like to burn Jews because Jews burn best. Horrible chants. And like everywhere else, this type of soccer anti-Semitism just escalated after October 7th.
Right, and it didn't only affect the professional level of soccer too, right? I think it was the anti-Semitism was felt most acutely by the Jewish indoor club teams who played in Amsterdam and in the area. Those teams have faced abuse and violence long before the Hamas attack, but after October 7th, the chairman of the Jewish club said that abuse only increased to the point where he had to turn to the authorities and say, look, condemnation isn't enough. We actually need security to make sure that Jews will ever be able to play soccer in this country again. And this wasn't only soccer either, of course. What he was describing mirrors the spike in anti-Semitism across Dutch society. Again, after October 7th, if you look at anti-Semitic incidents in 2023, it was double what it was in 2022.
Most of that was after October 7th, right?
Right, and that means the doubling doesn't even capture the problem. I mean, you can look at anti-Semitic incidents from October 7th, 2023 to November 7th, that 1 month, and compare it to the average monthly rate beforehand, and that would show an 800% increase compared to before the Hamas attack.
So given this surging anti-Semitism and the fact that in the soccer match, this planned soccer match between Maccabi Tel Aviv and Ajax, both of the teams were targets, the one Jewish and the other one that was considered pro-Jewish, people were concerned about security risks coming from the anti-Israel crowd rather than about the risk of violence between the fans of competing teams. The local anti-Israel groups that had been holding their regular anti-Israel demonstrations were now campaigning against the Israeli soccer team and against the upcoming match. They plastered posters all around Amsterdam calling for the expulsion of the Israeli team from the Union of European Football Associations and for cancellation of the upcoming match against Ajax. And the activists just amplified this campaign through social media. So the Ajax team and the Israeli authorities warned that this match was high risk, and they asked soccer fans not to display any flags from conflict areas and to avoid political expressions during the match. But as the date of the soccer match approached, the pro-Palestinian groups organized a large protest targeting the Israeli team and its supporters to be held at the gates of the arena both during and following the game.
So the tension's really building then. I assume the Dutch authorities had to get involved in some way.
Well, 2 days before the match, the Dutch daily newspaper, the Telegraph, reported that security agents for the Mossad would be accompanying the Israeli team. And on the day before the match, areas around the stadium along the metro route going to the stadium and at its certain designated areas in the city center were considered high security risk areas, presumably with more police stationed there. Amsterdam's mayor, Femke Halsema, along with the police chief and the chief public prosecutor, they're known collectively as the Triangle, they decided to move the planned anti-Israel protest from the immediate area of the arena to an alternate location about a kilometer away for security reasons.
And did the anti-Israel activists cooperate?
Well, they were pretty angry, but they were defiant. They posted the change of the venue on their social media platforms, and they made it clear that this was not a clash against rival soccer fans, but this was an extension of Hamas's fight against the Jewish state. They posted that even if we don't get our desired location, we won't give up. Even if we're restricted, we'll continue to stand up. And here are the telling words. They specifically said, this is a direct clash with our enemy, Israel occupation forces and the Mossad. They also warned participants anybody who would come to these protests to prepare themselves for grave violence. They suggested children or anybody dealing with risks concerning their residency. They suggested that they stay home and just support the protesters online because violence was expected.
Right, they're calling it a clash,
Right.
and they're worse
A
against
grave
the enemy.
violence. They specifically talked about grave violence that was expected. And these were fighting words. They were goading, provoking, and inciting anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic youth to prepare themselves for a violent night. So, Gilead, you looked closely at the violence. How did it all play out?
A good place to begin is 3 a.m. the night before the soccer match. So technically it's November 7th. It was actually November 6th at night. It's a better way to think of it. Mm-hmm. And at that time, there was a Jewish man filmed treading water in an icy Amsterdam canal. The video was recorded by the attackers who had forced him into the waters, and they were shouting at him. You can hear this on the video. They were shouting at him, "Kanker Yoda," which is cancer Jew, what you said, Ricki, earlier, a very common and extreme slur, anti-Semitic slur in the Netherlands. The attackers also told the Jewish victim that they're not going to let him climb to safety until he shouts out, "Free Palestine."
Say free Palestine and we go.
And I think this is a good place to start looking at the violence, also because we can see all of these elements, all the key elements on video. We see the threats. We see the results of the violence, the guy in the water. We can hear very explicitly the anti-Semitism in Dutch. And also because the attack and those elements reflect the nature of the conversation online. And what I mean is there was a chat group where hundreds of people were gathering and planning to attack, quote, the Jews. And they were planning to attack, quote, the Israelis and, quote, the Zionists. So there were these really overlapping bigotries that were the same ones that we saw in this video of the attack. There was Free Palestine, but there's also Kanker Yoda, cancer Jew, which tells us that, yes, of course, the attackers hate Israel, and clearly from their own mouths and from their own keyboards, they also hate Jews. And if you hate Jews, you're naturally going to hate Israel. Which is funny because the counter-narrative hinges on the idea that the bigotries are mutually exclusive, whereas the opposite is really true. They're very, very complementary.
Yeah, in fact, they use the terms Jews and Israelis interchangeably.
Repeatedly use Jews as often as they use Israelis. Mm-hmm. And this wasn't the only attack that evening. About, I think, an hour earlier and roughly a mile away, there were true Israelis who were beaten very badly at the Holland casino. They came in with bloody faces to the surprise of their friends who were in there. And it turned out that this wasn't a random attack at all. In the chat group that I had mentioned, there was a security guard who worked at the casino, and he had alerted the other people in the chat group who were planning violence of the Israelis who were gathering at the casino. And so what happened was that scores or even hundreds of attackers showed up in response to this call.
So these were all part of the same sort of social media group posting?
Yeah, there was one particular chat group where most of the attacks were planned and discussed, where with I think maybe even a couple of thousand participants in that group, and that was sort of highlighted by the Dutch investigations afterwards.
So this was the planning of the pogrom.
The planning group,
Yes.
And it worked. The security guard told his associates or the community about the Israelis, and the attackers descended. One victim describes being assaulted by a group of 20 people, kicked in the face to the point where he woke up in an ambulance with broken teeth and a bloodied face also. Other Israelis ended up barricading themselves in the casino, and the attackers were trying to break in. And so all of this at the casino, at the canal, but especially at the casino, can kind of be thought of as part one of the Jew hunt.
So where did that term Jew hunt come from?
Good question. It was a term that was repeatedly used by the attackers themselves, Jodenjacht in Dutch.
Vandaag gaan we op Jodenjacht, jongen. Op Jodenjacht.
We saw it just after the assault at the casino in this chat group. The security guard who called on the attackers, and various attackers were kind of congratulating themselves on the night's violence and planning a much bigger attack for the next night. And somebody wrote in that group, and this is a direct quote, "Tomorrow night after the attack, part 2, of the Jew hunt, part 2 of the Jodejacht. The security guard at the casino responded. By the way, he was eventually fired by the casino when it came out, but at the time he responded affirmatively and told the attackers that he'd let them know if the Yoda ended up coming back to the casino the next night. So in other words, part 2 was being planned on the chat group, which made the casino part 1 in their own terminology. And that planned part 2 is exactly what happened. The next day, even before the soccer match, there were people trying to march on the stadium while they were chanting and shouting, "Cancer Jews, cancer Jews." There's video of an older man during the day who was being chased and whipped by people who were wearing Palestinian flags on their backs and around their necks. Right after the match, someone posted onto this chat group, "Jews are arriving, Jews," that's his word, "Jews are arriving, we are waiting for them, brother, be ready," meaning be ready for Jew Hunt Part 2. One of the Israelis in Amsterdam explained that he was accosted by this large group. That was a typical modus operandi for these attacks, including someone with a knife who said, "You a Jew? Are you a Jew? Are you a Jew?" He was asked repeatedly. And you don't even have to take the victim's words for it. In this case, there was a Dutch anti-Israel activist named Annette de Graaf who had admitted that she herself saw people on scooters that night yelling Jews as they were confronting the people leaving the stadium, the fans. We also have video of fans being chased with the attackers yelling, "Cancer Jews, run! Cancer Jews, dirty cancer Jews." And again, these slurs in the streets reflected what was being said continuously in the chat groups about Jews specifically. The Dutch authorities have shared, the courts I think have shared some of the online messages that included "Cancer Jews must die," "Death to the cancer Jews," "Blast them," as in shoot them. Someone said, "I'll probably never get a chance to hit a cancer Jew again." Other people were fantasizing about Hitler sending a train full of gas to pick up the Jews.
Yes, so there was a lot of Nazi imagery in these social media posts, including concentration camps.
Yeah, fortunately, the people in the chat groups left plenty of evidence of their hatred and their motivation and of their attacks. And it continued throughout the night in the chat rooms. At the end of the night, someone was looking for more. He was asking, "Are there any Jews left?" His words, again, Jews. In fact, one of the first people who was violently assaulted right after the game was a man named Aaron. And that's notable because Aaron wasn't an Israeli. He's British, a British Jew. And what happened was he saw an Israeli being attacked, and he went over to try to sort of shield the guy as he was being kicked while on the ground. And the attackers said, "What's going on? Are you Israeli?" And Aaron said, "No, I'm British." But then they proceeded to beat Aaron anyway, because in the words of the attacker, "Oh, well, you helped a Jew, and so we're going to beat you." This kind of violence continued all night. They were described by the Dutch authorities as hit and run attacks all across the city, where groups of attackers would gang up on people, beat them, and then zip away as fast as they started on scooters or bikes. And they weren't minor attacks largely. There's video of a person even lying unconscious in the middle of the street, I think, and people were continuing to kick the motionless body. Which is a theme of many videos. There's videos of people kicked while down. In fact, one of the attackers is being charged with attempted manslaughter, for this very type of brutality of kicking someone on the ground. There's video of a dad and his son being attacked, of younger people, of older people, of a man pleading, "I'm not Jewish," just before he gets knocked out. Video of crowds of attackers waiting in ambush for their prey to pass and then beating them. And as a result of all these beatings, I think about 7 Israelis actually ended up in the emergency room, not just those who were bloodied up and with broken teeth, but actually treated in the emergency room as a result of these attacks.
So talk about how the Jews were protecting themselves.
I mean, for the most part, they were scrambling for safety. It was the flight side of the fight or flight equation. They were trying their best to make it back to their hotels, but they were being followed. They were told not to take cabs because many of the cab drivers were with the attackers. So they had to find a way back to their hotels. If they did, they would get in and lock the doors behind them. At the same time, the Dutch Jewish community were rallying to try to protect their co-religionists. They were organizing cars to help ferry people to safety. And in the middle of all these ambushes, as the fireworks were being fired and the beatings were being dispensed, there was one group of Israeli fans who armed themselves with sticks and with poles that they found on the ground. This is a group it's a subgroup of the fans called the Fanatics, who are basically soccer hooligans, right? They're not the type of people that I would like to associate with. They're zealous. They're known for using the kind of hateful, offensive language that soccer hooligans across the world too often use. But these fanatics were also getting text messages from people describing their violent attacks, and so that's when they picked up these weapons.
They were defending. They were helping protect the Israelis, the other victims of this pogrom.
That's exactly what Israelis explained independently. Multiple Israelis explained being basically rescued by these large groups of hooligans who are roaming together. When the Dutch police wouldn't or couldn't, I don't know, do anything to help them, it ended up being the hooligans who came to their aid.
They were the only ones who came to their aid.
And what's interesting, actually, is that there's video of these soccer hooligans picking up the sticks and the poles, and that video is being used to promote this counter-narrative that ended up developing, which argued that rather than the anti-Semitic violence, the actual issue was hooliganism by Maccabi fans, and they used this video of fans defending themselves to argue that the fans were the attackers and instigated this whole thing. Of course, this was a pretext because, like I just said, we know that the violence against the Jews had been pre-planned, right? The organization that you had talked about, the incitement that you had talked about, and the discussions in the chat rooms. This was all long before the video of the Fanatics, which isn't to say that the Fanatics are beyond reproach. I mean, there's video of them the day before a group of 50 the day before the match tearing a Palestinian flag down from the side of a building, for example. And then when they were confronted,
Well, they were watching. The one person tore the flag down, right?
yeah, they were right. Cheering. I think
Yeah.
one person was tearing down the flag. When they were confronted by a taxi driver who called them gangsters, I think some of them ended up pounding on the taxi, hitting the taxi with objects, and even dented his windshield a bit. There's also video of larger groups of fanatics heading toward the stadium on game day, chanting a song about that. You can see them on an escalator, going down the escalator, chanting about not just the IDF winning, but also effing the IDF effing the Arabs, which is a broad brushed and ugly kind of generalization. The vandalism is certainly vandalism. There's room for condemnation, right? And at the same time, there's room for perspective in the sense that nothing that these fanatics did, these hooligans did in Amsterdam, came anywhere near the top of the list when it comes to soccer violence, soccer hooliganism. And we don't even have to look at the 70s and 80s England. The hooliganism in Amsterdam itself in recent years far outpaced, you had already mentioned, Ricki, the chants, the anti-Semitism from these hooligans. And that's not all. Dutch hooligans have attacked soccer players on the pitch, and they've even arranged these types of battles where hooligans from different teams would meet up somewhere in a field away from the police in order to brutalize each other. And in fact, people have died in these organized violence in the Netherlands. So perspective is needed there. And more importantly, perspective is needed because despite the chants and despite the minor vandalism of this minority of fans, none of that justifies a widespread pre-planned Jew hunt seeking to harm and hurt the Jews. And I think most people understand that instinctively. And still, this was the heart of the counter narrative, the idea that these fanatics are some sort of excuse, really a pretext for anti-Jewish violence. We saw that excuse increasingly expressed online. And I think, Ricki, you saw the excuse starting to have an effect in other quarters as well.
That is right. But at first, the counter-narrative was confined to the anti-Semites and used to rally the forces, to bring more warriors on board to what we described as the pre-planned events. So to that end, the actions of the Maccabi fanatics were exaggerated, invented, amplified. It was used as a call to arms, both by the activists and the orchestrators of the pogrom, and by the radical politicians who supported them, like those from the Denk Party, which is a pro-immigrant, pro-Muslim party in the opposition. It was founded by Turkish immigrants, and it was politicians from this party, other parties as well, but particularly this party, the politicians were instrumental in pushing the counter-narrative. They not only tremendously embellished the rowdy actions of those fanatics, but they referred to them as Netanyahu's gang, which is code for Zionists, Israelis, and for Jews. But aside from these anti-Israel activists and their supporters, there was a relatively united Dutch front against the clear-cut anti-Semitic events, at least at the start. So Netherlands King Willem-Alexander expressed his deep horror and shock at the anti-Semitic violence, and he apologized for the fact that his country had failed the Dutch Jewish community both during World War II and again with the attacks after the game. He was pretty strong. The Dutch Prime Minister, Dick Schoof, who's an independent politician, he expressed his shame and horror about what had occurred and called it completely unacceptable anti-Semitic attacks on Israelis. And the mayor, Femke Halsema, repeatedly denounced the events. She held a press conference. She referred to an explosion of anti-Semitism, and she acknowledged that this brings back the memory of pogroms. She was firm to reporters that what had taken place was a crime for which there could be no excuse. At the same time, she defended the police from the criticism that they had failed to thwart the violence. And for his part, the Amsterdam police chief, Peter Hollander, he voiced sympathy and support for the victim, but his main focus was on defending the police. So he talked about police preparedness, and he talked a lot about soccer hooliganism, he emphasized what the Maccabi fanatics had done, but he portrayed this as a back-and-forth brawls between competing fads.
As if it was one of those unstoppable clashes that was
Yeah. Now, what was left unsaid by both the police chief and the mayor was what we had discussed, the pre-planned nature of the violent attacks, and the fact that the Mossad and the Israeli security officials had warned Dutch security authorities about the risks of coordinated pro-Palestinian groups. They had also seen these social media posts, and they warned that this was not, that it wasn't only near the stadium, but they should protect other points in the city as well. They recommended that security be boosted at hotels and train stations around the city. Now, according to that warning, and a subsequent report after the pogrom occurred by the Israeli Ministry of Diaspora Affairs and Combating Antisemitism, the party that was primarily responsible for organizing and driving the pogrom was the Palestinian Community Foundation, which is known by its Dutch acronym PGNL. And they have multiple online forums and connections to Muslim groups all around the country. So PGNL and the Dutch activist groups that are affiliated with them not only incited their followers through social media, but they also instructed them on how to prepare for significant violence and encouraged them to broadcast videos and photos of the violence on social media platforms as it was happening. Most importantly, this Israeli report pointed and described the group's direct connections with Hamas and the PFLP, which is another Palestinian terrorist group, and it noted that the pogrom was fueled and driven by Hamas and pro-Hamas propaganda, which appeared in almost every post, film, and photo that was shared.
Well, I noticed that even this call to record the attacks, in a sense, mirrored, or was it maybe even inspired by the Hamas, what Hamas did on October 7th, which was document the violence for their own propaganda purposes.
And despite all this information, despite their documentation, propaganda was gaining ground. So even while the attackers' own words and their posts exposed their anti-Semitic motives, and even though the king, the prime minister, and mayor all publicly condemned the anti-Semitism, the pro-Palestinian activists and the politicians who supported them, They were busy at work amplifying the counter-narrative that reversed victim and perpetrator. And outside the Netherlands, Hamas propagandists did exactly the same. So on November 8th, which was right after the pogrom,
The day after.
the day after, CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, which has its own ties to Hamas. It was founded by the leaders of a group that was part of the propaganda apparatus of Hamas, and its executive director notoriously cheered and justified Hamas's October 7th massacre. Well, CARE put out a statement that was geared at journalists that reversed roles and boosted the counter-narrative. They talked about openly racist Maccabi soccer hooligans who they compared to white supremacists in the U.S. And they proclaimed that the very notion that what had occurred was an anti-Jewish pogrom was just false propaganda from the Israeli government and picked up by far-right Dutch politicians in order to reinforce xenophobic paranoia about Europe's immigrant population. They warned media outlets not to repeat this Israeli propaganda.
Right. It was kind of a two-part directive or post by them. The first part was laying out the counter-narrative in a sense, which included blaming Jews for violence against Jews. And then at the very end of the statement, they directly addressed the media. They instructed them on how they must report, in their words, on the attacks, which reporters, of course, aren't taking their marching orders from CARE, but they don't really need to in a sense or many of them don't, because so many of these reporters and decision makers already share the same perspective. And I'm not exaggerating. You can think about the New York Times, where just after October 7th, 2023, just after the Hamas massacre, the New York Times hired someone who was previously an editor at Electronic Intifada, which is not only a pro-Hamas, it was actually a pro-October 7th outlet, which shockingly isn't the worst of their hires. After October 7th, they also hired a reporter who they knew had previously praised Hitler, saying Hitler is great. Again, this was in response to the October 7th attack. So there's certainly fertile ground for the counter-narrative in the press.
So the New York Times was pretty quick in echoing the counter-narrative, right?
It was pretty quick. Certainly elements of the counter-narrative started to be injected, literally injected. I'll give an example. The day after the attack on November 7th, after the Jew hunt, they published a piece about the unrest. And then 2 days later, they went back to the same article and updated it to insert a paragraph letting readers know, making sure that they knew that prior to the attacks, Maccabi fans were recorded on video marching through Amsterdam and chanting, gloating gloating chants about how there are no children left in Gaza, which is, a shocking claim. And this claim about the chant was a central part of the counter-narrative as a whole. But like so many other elements of the counter-narrative, it was actually absolutely false. There was no such video. I'll get to that later. But to answer your question, the coverage did keep on trending in that same direction in the days that followed the attack as reporting continued. They tended to now start equating the inflammatory behavior by some subsection of Maccabi fans, equating that as sort of a perfect mirror to the widespread violence by Dutch attackers, the Jew hunt by anti-Semites. And I know, Ricki, you started to see the same thing starting to infiltrate into Dutch politics as well.
Yeah, that's right. The adoption of the counter-narrative in the New York Times and the Western media was accompanied by the political debate inside the Netherlands about who was responsible for the violence, which laid open the political and societal rift about the absorption of the immigrant community, about anti-Semitism and all that. So, for example, instead of considering the implications of the Israeli report, I mentioned that tied the organizers of the pogrom to Palestinian terrorist groups, the Dutch justice minister dismissed the evidence as unconfirmed and directed his anger instead at Israel for interfering in Dutch affairs.
As if that's the real problem.
And the political debates in Amsterdam and in the Netherlands about the reemergence of an anti-Semitic pogrom became extremely contentious. First, there was an emergency debate about the pogrom at the Amsterdam City Council. and a no confidence vote was brought against the mayor by a right-wing party. This was defeated, but from the other side of the political spectrum, the municipal DENK party leader condemned the mayor for having given a biased interpretation of events at her press conference. In other words, she talked about the hit-and-run anti-Semitic violence, and he was very upset about that. And he, of course, blamed the violence entirely on the Israeli fans, and he denounced the mayor specifically for using the word pogrom in her description of the events. And so she was being attacked from both sides. She condemned the reported behavior of Maccabi fans, but she continued to insist that there was no excuse for the violent targeting of Israelis or Jews. And at least at that point, she stuck to her guns about using the word pogrom. She refused to take it back and said that she was interpreting the events from a moral perspective. Well, the parliamentary debate on the following day, this was at the House of Representatives at The Hague, that was even more contentious, and it lay bare even more the political division over immigration and about the rise of extremist ideologies. So Geert Wilders described what had happened. He talked about Jews, once again, being hunted down in the streets, beaten, abused, and stabbed. He connected it to what had happened in Holland during the Nazi regime. And he invoked all of the images and the eyewitness reports, the videos, the victim testimony that you've described, Gilead. And he implicated Moroccans and Muslims primarily as the perpetrators, quoting a news report of where one attacker told his victims, "We are the new Moroccan generation, and we will destroy you," to their victims. And these comments sparked a furious backlash from Wilders' opponents, who objected to the identification of perpetrators as coming from a specific group, particularly from an immigrant group. So they accused Wilders of pouring oil on the fire, and some tried to discredit his account by bringing up and further embellishing the counter-narrative. So Stephen Van Barle, the DENK party leader, he directly employed Hamas's MO of inversion, and he turned the victims into the perpetrators and the perpetrators into the victims. And he actually invented accusations from social media. Where was Mr. Wilders, he said, when this Maccabi scum made Dutch citizens unsafe because those Dutch people stand up for Palestine, because those Dutch people have an Islamic or Arab background. So, he suggested this was all Islamophobic. Where was Mr. Wilders when Maccabi thugs said to ladies wearing headscarves, "You Arabs, we will kill you"? Where was Mr. Wilders when dozens of Maccabi thugs in Amsterdam shouted, "F the Arabs, and it's good that there are no more schools in Gaza because those children have been murdered"?
The New York Times, the same sentence inserted into the New York Times.
Exactly. And it was somewhat of a blood libel, trying to show the Jews were celebrating the murder of the alleged murders of children. So the counter-narrative was being fleshed out and with inventions. But the most brazen inversion of this DENK leader was, where was Mr. Wilders when Maccabi thugs plotted with each other, "We're going to hunt down Palestinians, we're going to look for Palestinians to beat up," and then later again he repeated this. Mr. Wilders has kept quiet about the Palestinian hunt, the Muslim hunt, the Arab hunt of the Maccabi scum.
So he's claiming the talking point for himself. He's pretending that the hunt went the opposite direction.
Exactly. There was no Muslim hunt, just Jews trying to defend themselves. And so building the counter-narrative was based on the perpetrator's own words. When they called for Jew hunts, he just used that language, reversed their own damning words, and used their own language to describe the victims.
A big lie.
Yeah. Meanwhile, the political scene heated up even further when a junior minister of Moroccan descent, Nora Akbar, from the governing coalition, not from the opposition, she sparked the crisis because she resigned in protest of the remarks by parliamentarians who blamed the violence on Moroccan immigrants. And other members of her party, one of the coalition party, other members also threatened to resign in solidarity with her. And this endangered the coalition and triggered an emergency session of the cabinet. So the government did survive that crisis, but still, meanwhile, the global media outside the Netherlands was picking up and amplifying these various elements of the counter-narrative, and they helped it take deeper root, even among those who had earlier sympathized with Israeli and Jewish victims. So, for example, by November 18th, which was just days after Hassanah had condemned the violence and condemned her use of the word pogrom, she completely reversed course. She voiced regret for her earlier comments about a pogrom. And this was a 180-degree about-face on the side of the mayor, and she now claimed that the word pogrom was, she blamed the Israeli government and Dutch politicians for manipulating that term as political propaganda in order to discriminate against Moroccan and Muslim residents. And she even apologized for her initial characterization of what had happened as anti-Semitic, saying she hadn't known the true nature of the Israeli football fans. And she condemned the Israeli leaders who had called out the violence and publicly condemned it. So it's not only the Maccabi fans she was attacking now, but Israeli leaders, because they had supposedly, by coming out and publicly condemning this pogrom, they had put her under pressure to issue a public condemnation before she was ready. So this was they made me do an apology for her earlier moral clarity. Now, she wasn't the only government official who expressed resentment of Israel's public exposure of those who were behind the anti-Semitism. The justice minister and the foreign minister, they condemned the Israeli ministry's delivery to Dutch parliamentarians of that intelligence report that linked the pogrom instigators to Palestinian terrorist groups. And the fact is that Israel was shining an unwelcome light on the anti-Semitic players in the Netherlands, and their connections to terrorist groups was forcing politicians to grapple with and confront the rift in their society. And the fact that the counter-narrative was gaining ground in the foreign media gave them a way to deflect attention. So describe how the counter-narrative did gain ground in the media, and also maybe you can comment about how it may have influenced the politicians to shift blame or reverse course.
Right. There's kind of this chicken and egg question, or maybe the best way to think of it is a positive feedback loop. When you have one side, you have the politicians starting to advance the counter narrative a little bit, and that prompts the media to do the same thing. While the same thing happens in the opposite direction, the media takes a few steps towards the counter narrative, and the politicians follow. And really, they were both citing each other throughout. But the source of the counter-narrative, where it all began and originated, was social media. But the politicians and the mainstream media were paying attention to each other. I know that the New York Times added its inaccurate claim about the chant about children in Gaza before that was mentioned during the Dutch political debates. And it was after the political debates that on November 18th, for example, NBC published a headline that could have been written by the Denk Party and their spin. This headline said, "Amsterdam violence exposes anti-immigrant Islamophobia in the Netherlands," which is crazy. Not because there's no such thing as Islamophobia in the Netherlands. There is. The issue is that this isn't what the Jew hunt exposed, right? When you attack Jews, it exposes anti-Semitism. And in this instance, whether you like it or not, it did expose anti-Semitism that stemmed from within these immigrant communities. And tellingly, NBC never ran a headline about this, about the anti-Semitism, the same way they ran a headline about Islamophobia, even though it was Jews who ended up in the emergency room, even though it was because Jews were being hunted in the street. So you can certainly imagine this headline having been influenced by the debates in the Netherlands, or maybe even influenced by CARE's earlier.
Or gave them cover. Yeah, it gave them cover that the foreign media is even.
Yeah, it's a positive feedback loop. I can give one more actually very telling example of the media's counter narrative now, because it tells you a lot about what was actually happening. There's a Dutch headline on November 8th, which means the night after the worst of the violence, that read, Maccabi Tel Aviv hooligans assaulted taxi driver in Amsterdam. That was the headline, and the article kind of said the same thing, suggesting even that it was because of some terrible assault on a taxi driver that other taxi drivers ended up attacking fans at the Hollander casino, the Jew Hunt Part 1. But the most interesting thing about this article is if you look at the piece today, everything looks the same. The headline is the same. The text accusing the fans looks the same, except the images that used to be there, the images supposedly showing a taxi driver being assaulted, are gone. And instead, you see a little update box at the top of the page that says, oh, well, actually, we can't say with certainty that the images we had previously posted really did show an attack on a taxi driver, which is a huge understatement because the video described in the article didn't show an attack by Israelis on a taxi driver. It showed the exact opposite, Israelis being assaulted by taxi drivers. So this news report, just like the statements by the Denk politicians you had described, Ricki, was a brazen inversion of the facts. And again, it was a false claim that had originated on social media, but was echoed uncritically by the supposedly more serious media, which actually should have. There was a reason to be suspicious because the version that was shared on social media, where it originated, where the person sharing it claimed that it was an attack by Israelis, was perfectly silent. And in retrospect, that's strange, right? Because cell phones record audio. But the audio was scrubbed before the clip was uploaded. And what they actually scrubbed was audio of the victims of the attack standing up and starting to talk to each other in Hebrew. This was the evidence of who was being attacked and who was attacking. And the scrubbing of the audio tells you that this wasn't some sort of mix-up or mistake, right? This was an intentional lie. What I had described earlier as misinformation was largely fueled actually by disinformation.
Yeah, so this goes beyond embellishing and exaggerating. That this is and it goes beyond just inventing. This is a deliberate manipulation of the facts in order to bolster these inventions.
Manipulation, inversion.
Disinformation, as you say. So how many of these? How prevalent was this disinformation in the counter narrative and building the counter narrative?
It was very prevalent. I had mentioned a clip of a Jew who was forced into the canal while people were shouting "Cancer Jew" at him. This was posted online as evidence, supposedly, of Israelis behaving badly, as if this guy decided to jump into the canal and take a swim just for fun, disrespecting the city in a drunken stupor or something. Obviously, they had the people posting this had in the same way they had to cut the audio of the anti-Semitic slur to make their false claim, where they're showing a victim and presenting him as a perpetrator. Other videos, that video of the Israeli fans, the fanatics going down an escalator, was manipulated very heavily. Some people claimed that they were chanting "Death to Arabs." It was a mistranslation that was shared by CARE, for example. From CARE, it was retweeted by a distinguished professor of law at Rutgers University who was using this fake chant to distract from the anti-Jewish violence that had just happened. Same thing, Al Jazeera did the exact same mistranslation of the exact same clip. And this Al Jazeera journalist was retweeted by a Bloomberg reporter, and so on and so on. It rippled out. Others took, and this is also the source of the children in Gaza falsehood that ended up in the Times. One large Twitter account posted that as a caption, as the mistranslation of this video, claiming that the fans in the escalator could be heard chanting, "There are no schools in Gaza because there are no children. There are no children there anymore." They weren't chanting that. They were chanting "Let the IDF win" and so on, as I had mentioned earlier. But this post was viewed 2.5 million times, and other big social media accounts claimed the same thing, right? And it ended up everywhere.
And it was all a big echo chamber of social media, New York Times, they were all repeating each other.
And so what happened? This happened with the entirety of all of the misquotes and the entirety of the counter narrative. really went mainstream right around then, right around November 18th or so. We had mentioned the New York Times and NBC's contributions, but the counter-narrative at the USA Today, The Guardian, in Canada, the CBC and the Globe and Mail, in Australia, ABC, Netherlands outlets, FAZ in Germany, smaller outlets like the Media Line, even parts of the Jewish press started parroting these false claims from social media. And of course, once it hits the press, that's used for falsehoods on Wikipedia. And so the counter-narrative really went mainstream at this point. Countless people were told by supposedly credible sources that a vicious attack on Israelis was actually an attack by Israelis. They were told false translations about chants. They were told that the fanatics were picking up sticks, which they picked up in self-defense, were actually engaged in random acts of violence and instigating the counterattacks. They were told that minor violence and hooliganism was a legitimate reason for attempted manslaughter, as I mentioned earlier. This was used as an excuse.
So it's very, very difficult for the casual reader to know when something's truth, exaggeration, or outright invention. They probably don't expect it to be outright invention when it's reported by the mainstream media, but also when so many reports just repeat each other. So how are you able to realize that this was more than just an embellishment of fact, like with a kernel of truth, and that this was outright manipulation of facts and fabrications?
I can say I was certainly surprised at the beginning when I started to see social media bubble over with these claims about fans chanting "death to Arabs" and that there are no children or schools in Gaza. And I wasn't surprised because soccer ultras can't be outrageous, but I was surprised because this was in the middle of a kind of feeding frenzy of information where every video from Amsterdam was being shared and reshared. There was real video, fake video, misrepresented video from all sides, but especially as the counter-narrative was really kicking into gear, anything that could possibly be used to excuse the Jew hunt was being plastered all over social media. And despite this, as much as I tried, and I tried for weeks, I couldn't find video from Amsterdam showing fans marching through the streets singing about schools and children in Gaza. I found post after post claiming to show the video, but in each case I looked at the video and it didn't show what they claimed. And when I asked the accounts for proof, I heard nothing back. The tricky part is, though, proving a negative is hard. At what point do you decide that an absence of evidence is evidence of absence?
Right, exactly. So how are you able to prove that this was fabricated?
It actually was helpful, even though it was harmful in effect. It actually was somewhat helpful when the claims moved from social media to the mainstream media, because at that point there's more to work with, because the large media institutions at least claim to have a code of ethics that they abide by. They promise accuracy, they promise accountability, which means you can challenge them. And so we put that to the test. So just after the New York Times added its paragraph telling readers that there's this video of fans chanting about children in Gaza, I called on them to point out where this video is. And in response, look, I'll just say that it was clear to me that some people at the newspaper really didn't want to come clean, but they did eventually publish a correction and admit that they did not actually have video of this chant that they said that they had. Same thing with The Guardian in the UK. I asked them about what they had said was verified social media videos that showed the chant, and they admitted that they didn't verify any such video, and corrected their piece. The Media Line corrected their piece, the Jewish Chronicle, the Forward.
So did everybody correct when you pointed it out?
No, there were some outlets that refused to correct, even though they had admitted to me that they had no video and no proof of the chants. Others, for example, NBC News had insisted that it had social media footage showing fans chanting "Death to Arabs," and that they had even geolocated, in their words, the video.
Israeli fans seen on video chanting "Death to Arabs."
Again, I scoured social media. I saw no evidence of such a chant. I may have missed something, so I have an opportunity here to ask NBC to back up their claim. And what they told me was that, well, as a matter of practice, we don't release video to the public, which doesn't make sense in this case because we're not talking about proprietary video that was filmed by NBC cameras, right? Where they were referring to social media footage showing something. And yet, in the face of a challenge, they refused to even share a link to video very, very much in the public domain that would have substantiated their claim. So when I referred earlier to accountability in journalism, this isn't it. This was an absence of accountability in the service of a counter-narrative.
Yeah, but whether or not there remains some journalists who refuse or cannot or are unwilling to admit they were wrong, it is essential to confront these lies head on. The lies need to be confronted and debunked regardless of those recalcitrant journalists. What we learned from this entire episode is that regardless how biased or uncredible a source is, the original source, whether it's a terrorist supporting social media post or it's biased legacy media, these libels and lies build on themselves. And it's an interactive endeavor. Internal political dynamics are influenced by the global media and vice versa. Journalists quote politicians to bolster their claims, and politicians quote journalists to bolster theirs. And without this kind of exposure and pushback, people just accept it as an authoritative truth. So it has a snowball effect. And every layer that's exposed and peeled off, every building block of the counter-narrative slows the growth of this snowball.
Right. There's an echo chamber, there's a positive feedback loop, but it can be slowed, and it has to be slowed because unfortunately there doesn't seem to be a limit to what kind of behavior is going to be defended with a counter narrative, whether we're talking about the October 7th attacks or whether we're talking about the attacks in Amsterdam. And the reasons for it, in Amsterdam, you can think of the counter narrative as being built from different strands. There was the domestic politics that you detailed, Ricki, where this culture war in the Netherlands and really in other European countries as well that centers on immigration. Because of that, any conversation related to these immigrant communities, even if we're talking about conversations about anti-Semitic violence by members of these communities, becomes politically charged to the point where politicians fall in line with what their party position is on immigration, and that's how they interpret anti-Semitism. There's a public relations issue where you had mentioned the police department coming under fire for failing to stop the attacks. And so the police came out and said, well, they downplayed the anti-Semitism and pretended that this was just hooliganism that to an extent can't be stopped. But first and foremost, the main strand that's woven together is the hatred. It is a prime example of the new anti-Semitism.
And this, as we discussed, is gained ground not only in the Netherlands, but over the whole world. And it's fueled by propaganda, by Hamas propaganda, by terrorist propaganda, by inversion. It's fueled by a network of terrorist supporters. And their influence has ironically surged since October 7th. And I guess this is partly because in politics, there's no longer a nonpartisan consensus about what anti-Semitism is, what constitutes anti-Semitism, or about the efforts to combat anti-Semitism. This is not in the Netherlands, not in the US, nowhere in the world. The truth is we're living in a very dangerous world of rising anti-Semitism that masquerades as human rights advocacy.
The new anti-Semitism.
The new anti-Semitism. And it evokes very chilling historical comparisons and warnings.
The old anti-Semitism.
The classic anti-Semitism. And King Willem Alexander referred to this when he spoke to his people after this recent Amsterdam pogrom. He said, we must not look away from anti-Semitism on our streets because history has taught us how intimidation goes from bad to worse with horrific consequences. So we have to continue to do this, to do what we're doing, to expose, to publicize the truth, and not to turn away or try to brush anti-Semitism under the carpet.
Since the filming of this podcast, a government plan to curb anti-Semitism in the Netherlands, announced in the wake of the pogrom, has yet to yield positive results. In June, the Dutch government collapsed when Geert Wilders, Israel and the Jews' staunchest defender in the government, withdrew his party from the ruling coalition. In August, Dutch anti-Israel groups, including the Amsterdam branch of Students for Justice in Palestine, secretly filmed Israelis visiting a park in the Netherlands and posted the videos on social media alongside calls to mobilize their followers to track the whereabouts of Israeli tourists and target them, and make clear they are not welcome. Echoes of the November pogrom. Days later, 2 Israeli tourists were violently assaulted at a different holiday park in the Netherlands, leaving them hospitalized with nose, head, and eye injuries. And like the earlier pogrom, authorities were hesitant to call out the anti-Semitism for what it was. Dutch police refused to depict it as an anti-Semitic incident, or even one motivated by anti-Israel sentiment, portraying it instead as an altercation over a paintball game that escalated into a brawl. The case study analyzed by camera remains as relevant as ever, as the new anti-Semitism continues to gain force.